briefing, and the committee is now relinking in for our second briefing of the afternoon on cybersecurity. This is being streamed, so I want to welcome our committee and also Budget and Tax of the Maryland Senate, as well as the public who will be watching this. Today's briefing is from the Cybersecurity Council on state and local cybersecurity recommendations. They've been working diligently to come up with a list of recommendations, which hopefully will be translated into legislation. I think for many of us, this comes at a time after we've been dealing with the department, the ransomware attack, Department of Health, which is, while not immobilizing services in our state, has created a bit of a wrench, whether it be in licenses for people who are needed to service the public, or just the ability to address data on the pandemic. It's been a very big concern, obviously, and the legislature has been demanding and crying for transparency on what the problem is and how we can avoid it in the future. And that really is at the crux of this, of how we can make the investment of resources and policies to ensure we have protection and have a system in place for the state of Maryland that we can continue to function. So with that, we have Dr. Gregory von Lehman from the University of Maryland Global Campus, formerly UMUC, I think the commercial goes, and who's staff to the Cybersecurity Council, as well as Ben Yellen, University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security, who's a program director for public policy and external affairs. I do believe they have some backup of some other stakeholders who will be available to answer questions if it goes beyond their purview from the public sector, I think maybe even the private sector, to answer more nuanced, detailed questions. So with that, Dr. Lehman, are you starting off? Or
yes, sir.
Okay, welcome to the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee, as well as Budget and Tax. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members.
Let me interrupt you again. Chairman Gazone, do you want to offer anything? Okay. Thank you. I apologize. Please continue.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir. So, on behalf of Mr. Yellen and myself, we appreciate very much the opportunity to provide an overview of the report on Maryland state and local cybersecurity that was published by the Hoc Committee of the Maryland Cybersecurity Council. The Hoc Committee recognizes certainly the pivotal role of this committee in cybersecurity legislation. Again, for the record, I'm Greg von Lehman, University of Maryland Global Campus. I'm here solely in my role as staff to the Maryland Cybersecurity Council and as one of the lead authors on the report. As the report states, it's the result of a broad collaborative effort that included DoIT, MDEM, MACO, and many others, some of them outside the state of Maryland, and that it also benefited from the series of hearings that were conducted by the Joint Committee on Cybersecurity, IT, and Biotechnology over the summer and fall of last year. Senator Hester, of course, co-chairs that committee as she co-chaired the Hoc Committee. In that vein, as Chairman Pinsky mentioned, joining us are two other Hoc Committee members. We have Secretary Strickland from MDEM and Kevin Canali from MACO. We also have a private sector representative, Mr. Sam Bell, who is CISO at Edwards Performance Solutions here in Maryland. We're all pleased to answer any questions that the committee might have after this presentation.
Yeah, Dr. Lehman, tell us what MDEM is. Let's put aside the short-term letters, and at least for those who might not be familiar with what some of these organizations are. Okay,
yes, sir. Thank you. So MDEM is the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. MACO, of course, the Maryland Association of Counties. So are we going to have the slides up for the presentation? That would be most helpful.
Give us a moment.
Okay.
Ms. Stanton, up.
Is it the video, Senator Pensky?
I'm not sure. Dr. Lehman, is it a video?
No, no, sir. It's a PowerPoint presentation.
A PowerPoint?
Yes, sir. And if they give me sharing rights, sir.
And I will do that. I'm going to give you sharing rights.
Okay.
Okay, you should be good.
Okay. Can everyone see that? All right. Let's see. So we understand the focus of this afternoon, but for the committee's awareness, the Maryland Cybersecurity Council produced 2 reports on critical infrastructure last year. The other is concerned with the cybersecurity of the electric utility sector serving Maryland. Both reports will inform bills this session. So we have just one slide at the end that keeps us within our allotted time and highlights key recommendations that will be captured in what we understand to be the proposed legislation. The ad hoc committee was assigned 3 tasks in our briefing today. We'll follow that organization, which also corresponds to the direction that we were given for this brief. I will cover task 1, cybersecurity governance in general. Mr. Yellen will cover tasks 2 and 3, state cybersecurity and local government cybersecurity. So in its examination of questions posed about governance, the ad hoc committee made 20 recommendations. Most of them fall into 6 buckets, as you can see here, and I will skip through each of these buckets for you. The most significant recommendation of the council concerns this particular theme, centralization and consolidation. The recommendations call for codification of the executive order that established the state chief information security officer role and its authorities. But the recommendations go farther. They call for the consolidation of IT and cybersecurity staff and budget across the state executive branch. This would mean that all IT staff within the agencies would report to the DO-IT secretary, and that all cybersecurity staff within the agencies would report to the state chief information security officer. It would also mean that the separate IT and cybersecurity budgets that now exist within the agencies would be consolidated to form one IT budget and one cybersecurity budget for the state executive branch to be administered respectively by the DO-IT secretary and the state chief information security officer. These benefits are in part the flip side of some of our findings. DO-IT does not have complete visibility into systems at the agency level. That came out in one of the joint committee hearings. It does not have complete visibility into the security priorities of agencies, their staffing, or their cybersecurity budgets. At this time, it has limited visibility into agency compliance with its security policies. So consolidation, centralization would break down these silos and would better enable the state chief information security officer to manage the cybersecurity of the state executive branch by having greater visibility into systems within agencies, being able to set security priorities, and achieve economies of scale with systems, tools, and so forth. The second set of recommendations aim to close some gaps in the state supply chain, which is a significant vector for compromise in any organization. These recommendations would require any state contractor organization that would have access to state databases to meet certain recognized cybersecurity standards, and would also require smaller procurements to go through a cybersecurity review, even though small procurements, because small procurements can buy a significant amount of risk. Cybersecurity is all about risk management. This entails knowing the threats to your organization, the risks or exposures that you have, prioritizing those risks, and tying budget requests to those priorities. The Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council was set up by the executive order to help the state chief information security officer manage risk, but it has not matured into this function. So to get there, the ad hoc committee makes two big recommendations. One is that agencies start compiling risk registers, basically risk assessments by system and business function that those systems serve, that these risk assessments be aggregated and reported up in a way that would give the Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council and the state chief information security officer kind of a bird's eye view of cybersecurity risk across the state executive branch, enable them to prioritize risk and then to make recommendations in their budget proposal that would be tied to those priorities. The other big recommendation that I'll highlight here is that in order to permit those very sensitive conversations, that the Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council be exempt from the Open Meetings Act. The perspective of several professionals interviewed for this study and their views are reflected in the 2020 National Survey of State CIOs by the National Association of State CIOs. The view is that the chargeback model for cybersecurity creates a tension between the budget priorities of agencies to offer and support digital services for the general population on the one hand, and the need to invest in cybersecurity on the other. Every agency head would say IT is a must-have, but cybersecurity can become a nice-to-have. So the result is the possibility, even the likelihood, of an underfunding of the cybersecurity function. Consequently, the ad hoc committee recommended that the state chief information security officer's cybersecurity budget be an appropriated budget. Now, the question is, how much should be dedicated to cybersecurity? This is a question that every organization faces, public or private sector. One benchmark metric that is used by analysts to make comparisons across organizations within a given sector is the ratio of cybersecurity spending to total IT spending. For example, the ratio for federal civilian cybersecurity spending to total civilian IT spending is between 16 and 17%. A Deloitte study based on a 2019 survey of financial services firms put their cybersecurity spending at about 11% of their total IT spending. So the ad hoc committee recommended the adoption of this or a similar metric to guide cybersecurity spending. Do It, of course, has an IT master plan, and the ad hoc committee recommended that it should include timelines and metrics that would better define what success looks like. The IT master plan, of course, includes goals and objectives for the state executive branch cybersecurity. But if there's to be an appropriated budget, the ad hoc committee recommended that there be a separate and more extensive cybersecurity strategic plan to support those budget requests, and a number of other states do require this. And to wrap up my portion of this presentation, given the great importance of cybersecurity to protecting data held by the state government and to continuity of agency services, the ad hoc committee recommended that there be public accountability for cybersecurity spending, just like there's accountability for other types of critical government spending. Specifically, we recommended that the state, just like the federal government, publish its IT budget, its cybersecurity budget, and adopt a benchmark like the ratio of federal civilian cybersecurity spending to total civilian IT spending, so the public A knows just how much is being spent across the executive branch on cybersecurity, and B has a metric against which it can evaluate the overall effort of the state. So this concludes my portion of the briefing. Mr. Yellen will follow. Thank you.
If there's no objection, we'll hold questions till after the second part of the report is given.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and thank you again, Dr. von Lehman, if you wouldn't mind changing the slides, as you are the controller of the slides. I'm going to discuss task 2 and task 3. Task 2 concerned cybersecurity at our state agencies. I want to start with a disclaimer. We were assisted in this effort by our state Chief Information Security Officer, Chip Stewart. He was integral in gathering this data. He nor anybody within the Department of Information Technology was involved in any of the recommendations. And I'll give a similar disclaimer for task 3 on units of local government. We were assisted in our efforts by both Acting Secretary Strickland and many dedicated staff members of the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, but they too were not involved in the recommendations portion of the report. So obviously, as we know from recent events, cybersecurity within state agencies is a very unique challenge. To help address this challenge and ameliorate some of these concerns, over this past summer, we, in coordination with the State Chief Information Security Officer, sent a survey to 89 units of state government. We were lucky in that 70 of those units responded, and we were able to collect rich data on some of the vulnerabilities and shortcomings among our state agencies. This survey was a collaboration between the Department of Information Technology, the Cybersecurity Council, members of the Joint Committee in this legislature, and this ad hoc committee. And Greg, you can go to the next slide, Dr. von Lehman. I'm just going to highlight some of our high-level findings. This is not an exhaustive list of our findings, but some of the most notable that can help inform legislation as it relates to state agencies. We found that of the 70 respondents, more than half of them had not identified recovery time objectives or recovery point objectives for their systems. So they didn't have a goal of how quickly they need to restore a system or a network after some sort of cyber incident in order to sustain their mission essential functions. Nor did the majority of them have a recovery point objective. So how far back you would have to go to restore the data, whether that was a day's worth of data, a week's worth of data, et cetera. While more than 80% of these agencies had an inventory of their IT systems, of course, ideally, we would want that number to be closer to 100%, and that informs some of our recommendations. Go to the next slide. One of our primary findings in this portion of the survey was that 46% of units within state agencies have at least one legacy system. Legacy systems are a major cybersecurity concern. They don't contain the most robust current cybersecurity protections, and they increase vulnerabilities for each of the agencies that use them. So one of our major recommendations is modernization, helping these agencies identify their legacy systems and encouraging them and providing the funding to modernize those systems. Go to the next slide. I'm actually going to skip this one in the interest of time. So Dr. von Lehman, you can continue. I'm going to summarize the key recommendations on task 2. Originally, as part of the ad hoc committee, our recommendation was to conduct a biannual cybersecurity of state agencies. The final report actually advocated an annual security of state agencies to be done every single year. The ad hoc committee recommends that each unit of state government should complete an inventory of their IT system by the end of this year to successfully manage risk. Per our findings, each state unit should develop specific recovery time and recovery point objectives to ensure system recovery and continuity of essential services in the event of a breach or a cybersecurity incident. The ad hoc committee encourages regular backup operations and frequent restoration testing. State agencies should operate with multi-factor authentication practices, particularly in this era of remote work, when many of us are working off campus, so to speak. This is an era of remote access, and multi-factor authentication is critical for cybersecurity. The ad hoc committee recommends that units of state government conduct cybersecurity training that reflects best practices and is available for full-time employees and contractual employees, and then prioritizing funding for upgrades to those legacy systems to augment modernization efforts. You can go to the next slide. Task 3 concerned our units of local government. So we were assisted in this effort by many stakeholders, including the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. Also, Kevin Canale, who's joining us today with the Maryland Association of Counties, was critical in convening some of our county IT specialists who gave great insight for this portion of the report. We sent a survey to county governments, municipal governments, school districts, and local emergency managers to find out what they're doing to prepare for and respond to cyber incidents, and to help identify what the key risk factors are to their systems and networks. Each of the surveys were slightly different depending on the particularities of those units, but they generally concerned assessing risk, managing risk, and what these units of local government would like to see the state do to improve the cybersecurity posture of these units. Again, I'm going to present some of the high-level findings here. We held a focus group of individuals from county IT departments back at the Maryland Association of Counties Conference in August of 2021. A lot of the representatives stated that their counties are not allocating sufficient resources to cybersecurity. They noted that they believe the state should provide additional funding to assist counties in obtaining resources, both in preparedness efforts and in the event of a cyber incident for response. And they also reiterated that not only is the state burdened by legacy systems, but oftentimes because a state agency uses a legacy system, that filters down to the county. So if the Maryland Department of Health is using a legacy system, local health departments might be relying on that same legacy system, and that prevents security liabilities. Next slide, please. For the survey we sent to local emergency managers, the most common barriers they identified in terms of mitigating risk were time, staffing, resources, and of course, those legacy systems. It was good to see that 85% of our surveyed jurisdictions maintained cyber insurance, and that 90% of those jurisdictions conducted regular technical cybersecurity awareness training, sending those phishing emails that we're all used to getting in our email inboxes. But more than half of the respondents did not have a consequence management plan for cybersecurity incidents, nor did they have a continuity of operations annex specifically dedicated to cybersecurity. Oftentimes, this can seem to be an abstract problem for any locality, but as we know, cyber incidents have befallen some of our largest jurisdictions, Baltimore City in 2019, the Baltimore County School District last year, and some of our smaller jurisdictions. Leonardtown was affected by a cyber incident, and it has happened across our state. To the next one, Dr. Von Lehman. Some highlights of our school system survey. Only 31% of respondents to the school survey indicated that their school system allocates sufficient resources to cybersecurity in their budget. There is a major disparity. We found this out both through our survey data and our conversations with representatives from these school districts between urban and rural communities. Oftentimes, our rural school districts only have 1 or 2 members of their IT staff. They don't have any dedicated staff specifically for cybersecurity, and that creates additional vulnerabilities in some of those smaller jurisdictions on the Eastern Shore and in Western Maryland. And only 21%, I'm sorry, Dr. Von Lehman, 21% of the respondents reported that they had a disaster recovery plan and incident response plan that had been updated in the previous year. Next slide, please. On our municipalities survey, 55% of the respondents indicated their jurisdictions maintain cyber insurance. Ideally, we would like to increase that number. 90% of the respondents reported that their municipal governments had not conducted a vulnerability assessment of their own IT infrastructure and network. Municipalities are a diverse bunch. We have thousands of municipalities in the state of Maryland. Some of them are extremely small jurisdictions that might not even have their own full-time IT staff. But this was still a striking finding that we got through our survey. And none of the respondents reported that their jurisdictions conduct regular technical cybersecurity awareness training to protect their systems and networks. That leads us to our recommendations. In previous years, through the efforts of this committee and Senator Hester, with the leadership of Secretary Leahy and Acting Secretary Strickland, we've had discussions on a bifurcated cybersecurity effort as it relates to units of local government. So this would be between the Department of Information Technology and the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. In the report, there is a matrix describing the primary roles of each of these agencies. Generally, DO-IT is responsible for technical support, technical evaluation of prevention plans and mitigation. And the Maryland Department of Emergency Management plays their customary role: communications, coordination, and resource allocation. We do not want to reinvent the wheel in terms of that resource allocation, coordination, and communications. The Department of Emergency Management now has a cybersecurity preparedness unit within the preparedness branch of the Consequence Management Directorate of MDEM. It is the recommendation of the Ad Hoc Committee that this unit be fully funded so that the staff can be supported and can most effectively help units of local government. I'm going to highlight our final recommendation here, which is to establish a local cybersecurity support fund. The Ad Hoc Committee makes no recommendations as to the details of that fund, how it would be administered, which agency would administer it, whether it would be a non-lapsing fund, et cetera. But we recommend a fund to be available to units of local government to harden current devices and networks, purchase new devices, hardware, software, gadgets, potentially help fill some of the gaps caused by staffing shortages within these IT agencies, and to pay outside vendors for cybersecurity related trainings. And all of these recommendations are luckily going to make their way in some of the legislation that is going to be proposed and will come in front of this committee. And with that, I will hand it back to Dr. Von Lehman.
Is that the end of the presentation, Dr. Van Lehman?
That's the end of the presentation on the Maryland State and Local Government Cybersecurity Report. If I could have 30 seconds, I would just highlight the other.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the other critical infrastructure report published by the council last year is called the Cybersecurity of the Maryland Electric Grid. This was actually produced by an NSA employee who was staffed full-time to the Attorney General's office for 1 year under a fellowship program. Altogether, her report makes 29 recommendations. And while many of the recommendations can be implemented without the need for additional legislation, Senator Hester's office selected several that may benefit from codified guidance. Specifically, there's one recommendation in the report which requires public utilities to include resiliency in their own quality and reliability standards. There are two recommendations which respectively require service providers to adopt the NIST cybersecurity framework and to advance towards zero trust architecture for both on-premises and cloud services. And then finally, there's a recommendation that would require some collaboration among grid owners, state government, local governments to establish a process to look at the Maryland electric grid and to identify, assess, and prioritize risks together. The results of this process would be used to administer a new grant program by the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, would be available to utilities for cybersecurity and their resiliency projects. And as I understand it, this grant program would pull funds from the state, local, tribal, and territorial grant program, about $1 billion allocated, surface transportation grant program, and additional DOE or EPA grants that are available for energy grids and water systems. So with that, sir, we conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank both of you for your work and leadership on this and staffing. Before I start calling on colleagues, I think we want to focus on the first two or three parts. I think the electric grid brings in a lot of other areas, and obviously finances committee is also concerned about that. So let's try to focus on the first three sections, the one Dr. Van Lehman did and the two that Mr. Yellen did. So with that being said, we'll start with Senator Rosapep, followed by Senator Kagan, followed by Senator Ellis.
Thank you very much. And this is obviously incredibly important, and it's very, very interesting. I suffer from not knowing very much about this field. So I just wanted to ask a couple of sort of 30,000-foot questions. One is my impression correct that the major source of cybersecurity challenges is people trying to do ransomware, people trying to steal social security numbers and stuff, and then do fraudulent stuff, and then hostile foreign powers? Are those the big three, or am I missing? Are they the bottom three? What are the big threats, just briefly?
Well, I think everybody on the panel would have something to say in connection with that, so maybe I'll just start briefly. Threats are all, to an organization, always correlate with what that organization does and what data it holds. And the threats can be to data, and it can also be to operating systems or services.
Right.
So the threats are manifold. Yes, definitely, national state actors are, I would say, are a risk to the state, but there are criminal groups that are also a risk to the state, and those would be my top two. Those are the bad actors. There are many different ways of causing problems. Ransomware obviously is one, but there are obviously other kinds of attacks that simply aim to disrupt services without extorting anything, or simply to collect data on the sly.
Right.
But let me defer to other members of the panel who may want to add something to that.
One thing I'll add is we generally do think about ransomware. I'll note, and this has to do with a bill Senator Kagan proposed. Another type of cyber attack is denial of service attacks on public service answering points. So obviously that can have serious kinetic effects if people who actually need to make emergency calls are not able to do so. We've seen that in localities across the country as well.
And who is doing that? I mean, what's the motivation there?
Cyber criminals. I'll also, Senator Kagan, I can defer to you as the author of the legislation.
I mean, I don't want to drag this out too much. People got a lot of questions, a lot of issues. I'm just trying to follow-up questions. So I'll take the first answer. That's fine.
I'd like to just add one component to it as well that this survey does call out, and that is also the importance of cybersecurity assessments to look at all of the controls that go around your system. So when you look at it, probably more than half of those controls that you're looking at are not necessarily technical controls, but they're operational controls and procedural controls and things like separation of duties and whatnot. All things that basically lay the framework for making sure that you have what they would call defense in depth.
Great. No, I got that. I'm thinking of this more from a resource allocation point of view, is concept of the threats, where are they coming from? Second question is, and I know it's only part of it, but to what extent in your survey of state government and maybe local government too, to what extent are we holding 90% of our data, or is 90% of our data in the cloud? Because the threats are different. I mean, you go where the data is if you're going after data. Does anybody know the answer? No.
Well, I don't know the answer to the question of total state data, but obviously a huge amount of state data is in Maryland. I think it's called Maryland Think, the cloud project that's been underway for several years.
Well, the reason I read your question, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know much about the area. I would think that the stuff that is in the cloud, you attack the owner of the cloud.
Not necessarily. I mean, certainly that's one vector. Where you go, let's say your cloud provider is AWS or it's Microsoft Azure. Exactly what the responsibilities are for securing your data, that's kind of worked out in a service level agreement. But even if the data is locked down at the cloud level, you still have users coming in from endpoints, within state agencies and so forth. And depending on the security of those endpoints,
you can get in that way.
Exactly.
No, I get that. So last question, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, some data is more important to protect than other data, and some access is more important than others. You gave the example of 16% number, I think, of ratio to spending in the federal government. I think that was the number you used?
Yes, sir.
And ours is much lower. Well, obviously, we can't have perfect security. We don't have perfect security in any part of human condition. So are there metrics to figure out which data or which systems it's worth investing more money in protecting than others. And did you look at that?
Yeah, maybe Mr. Bell would want to comment on that.
Actually, I think I'd probably defer to one of the senators on that one, since that was part of the study itself. What I will offer up though, just on the point of on the cloud itself, is that part of this of this study is pointing out that we need to make sure that all of these individual cloud systems that have been implemented by different agencies and whatnot throughout the state, that they all are managed and the identities are managed in a consistent fashion, to make sure that we haven't just splintered the problem by pushing it into the cloud.
Answer the question, Mr. Chair.
Very, very briefly, because that question that he asked could be a conversation by itself. And obviously, it will be an ongoing conversation.
Right. I mean, I think the short answer is we do not know what data we have, Senator Rosappat. That's because we haven't done, the agencies can't identify what systems they have and do it doesn't have the insight over those agencies.
Therefore, we don't know the value of what
Right.
we have.
Very hard to prioritize your risk when you
Right.
don't.
I got it. That answers the question. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, I'm going to call on Vice Chair Kagan, and before she asks her question, she can take 15 or 20 seconds to answer Senator Roosevelt's question about the attacks on the emergency. Who would be doing that? I think was his question.
Yeah.
If it's not a foreign power,
Yeah.
who would be trying to interfere with 911 calls being sent out? So very
Yep, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Yellen, for mentioning the TDOS and DDoS, the telephonic denial of service and digital denial of services, people jamming our 911 centers in either of those ways. So Senator Rosapep, thank you for the question. Yes, it could be foreign powers, but sometimes it is literally, and we've had examples of kids on a, whether they think it's a game or something that's a fun exercise. And that's why we're seeking to make sure that it's outlawed and to increase penalties. And like, this isn't funny, guys. Like if someone needs 911, they've got to be able to get through.
It's like joyriding, taking somebody's car.
Right. So that's as succinct as I can make it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as the senator for NIST, I just want to translate that acronym because it's the coolest federal agency that most folks don't know about. It's the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And so using their guidelines, which is what was represented and suggested in your PowerPoint, is great and important. So I just want to make sure my colleagues know what that is and anyone watching at home. I have two questions. One, Anna Sierra at MDEM, the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. I wonder if you and Secretary Strickland might be able to give us any inkling yet, or is it premature, about how the grant money would be prioritized and distributed? Because sometimes those that ask for money, aren't always the ones that need it the most. And so some folks don't even know what they don't know. And then the second question might be for Mr. or Dr., I apologize, Von Lehman, which is, are our laws sufficient to disincentivize, to use an SAT word, this sort of hacking and all evil stuff? And I know that Senator Hester has done amazing work on that. So I'd love your perspective on that. But maybe MDEM, Ms. Sierra, if you might be able to answer that first part. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Either of the two representatives from MDEM, please.
Chairman and Senator Kagan, let me answer. That's Russ Strickland, the Acting Secretary for the Department of Emergency Management. And I apologize, my voice is just a little bit fading off because I'm fighting the COVID with isolation at home. But to your question on the grant money, we have received money through a grant program under the Homeland Security grant program. And that's basically enough for us to put together a team to go out and basically work with the local jurisdictions to plan, train, and exercise plans, whether it be an annex into their consequence management plan specifically for a cyber attack, work on their COOP plan that would include an annex for cyber.
Continuation, COOP, why don't you spell that out?
Continuity of operations
Continuity
plan
of operations.
program. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. And so that's what we have right now. And that's a grant that we'll probably have for at least a couple cycles, but that's always subject to change based upon the source that it's coming from.
Thank you.
So
I'd love to hear more and how you would prioritize it, Mr. Secretary, Acting
But
Secretary. You get
there is money that each of the jurisdictions receive through the Homeland Security Grant Program that they can utilize now for cyber. And we do have a percentage of the total cyber or total Homeland Security Grant Program must be an investment into cyber security protection. So we're monitoring that very closely. The actual priority right now is being established by the local jurisdictions.
And jurisdictions, you mean counties, or are you including municipalities?
Counties and the city of Baltimore.
Okay, so I would be interested to know, and maybe Mako can tell us this, or MDEM can tell us this, are the counties required to funnel some of that down? Because some of our municipalities are large enough and can be vulnerable, as we all know. And I do not have COVID. I just have a sore throat because
Okay, good.
I've been talking too much for a change.
Okay, we'll get back on that one. To the senator's second question, I think back to Dr. Van Leeman or Mr. Yellen, if you can recall what the second question was.
It was about, are our laws sufficient?
Well, as I understood your question, it was about sufficient to disincentivize attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, number one, that's a very good question. It's not one that we dealt with within the study. We were given a list of questions and had a very compressed time of several months to put the study together. But I will say the state, and I'm not an attorney and not familiar with the entirety of the state's criminal code, but certainly in recent years, the state has taken important steps in that direction. I mean, last year, of course, Senator Lee's bill criminalizing ransomware was an important step. This year, your bill with respect to 911 centers is another. So these are good steps, and it would be for members of the legislature who are more familiar with with the criminal code to know where we should go next. I think Mr. Yellen, as an attorney, may have some things to share on this, but just one other point, and that is if a nation state actor is involved, obviously the game shifts to the federal level. You have FBI involved and other federal authorities who would be involved in a case like that. Yeah. Mr. Yellen, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think your last point's critically important if you're dealing with a nation state or a rogue actor. The law enforcement becomes difficult, and oftentimes, you can secure an indictment against a group, and you're never actually going to bring the perpetrators to justice because they're outside our jurisdiction, or we don't have an extradition treaty with that country. So there's only, I guess, there's a lot you can do with the criminal code, but there are some things you simply can't do with the criminal code within the state.
Great. Thank you. Senator Ellis.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellent presentation. Thank you for this. I have a background. I began my career in the military and the Air Force, and what we call the cybersecurity now, different names back then. And I know at the federal level, and those of my colleagues who have worked at the federal level, there are levels of classification where information is protected, information, data on systems and operations, and you name it. And so I was pleased to hear Dr. Van Leeman talk about not, exempting some of these meetings with the cybersecurity from the Open Meetings Act. And besides that, what else is done? I mean, I've never heard of a level of protection for data at the state level. And also, that's my first question, is there that being considered? Also, you mentioned, Dr. Leeman, let's see, the cyber, two budgets, separate budgets, one for cyber and one for IT operations. So of course, cyber is intertwined with the IT. It's because of IT why we need to have cybersecurity. So how would you separate those two budgets, if I understand you correctly, that you wanted a separation to have two separate budgets?
Well, to take your second question first, your IT budget would concern the plumbing and the wall, it would concern the, the network systems and servers and so on that are just used day to day. Your cybersecurity budget would be dedicated to those tools and other investments necessary to secure those, to secure the plumbing. And other states, do separate these budgets. So it is possible to make distinctions.
So really quick with that. So if you have, say, these legacy systems is an old system. It doesn't have many protective technology in there. So if you want to get rid of a legacy system and to improve cybersecurity, and the primary reason being that system works well, except that it's not very secure, you would separate that upgrade into, say, IT versus cybersecurity?
Yes, I would consider that an IT capital investment. And
Okay.
Mr. Bell, maybe you would want to comment on this and see he deals with similar decisions in the private sector.
Yes, I think you would have to just figure out exactly where those lines are from an infrastructure perspective, who owns the firewall, those types of things. But those are the types of details that would get hammered out at the end of the day. But, upgrading a legacy system, obviously, that's a rather large lift all by itself. Even before you begin to think about integrating it with, say, an identity management system or something, sort of a common login or anything along those lines. So there are ways that you can break up the architecture in order to make sure that you have clear lines of responsibility as to who's managing which pieces of the architecture as you go ahead and develop and replace that legacy system. Hope that helps.
Thanks. And of course, the first part of my question, sir, as far my first question on protecting levels of protection for systems as far as some public viewing, especially since we have foreign actors. If the federal government is all tight, they'll come and think they can mess with our grid. We have different power plants, nuclear power plants. Is there consideration being done at the state level for any kind of protection of our systems and our plans?
Well, first of all, my understanding is under the executive order, I think 2019 that we've referenced a couple of times, and then most recently, the governor's executive order on concerning a state privacy officer and how that person would work with DoIT and so forth. There is an effort underway, first of all, to just understand all the data that the state has and to categorize those data as a first step to doing exactly what you have suggested. Once the data is understood, then you can make decisions about what should be more protected. If you've got to spend money, where your security should go, more security should go, where less security should go.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Simon, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure seeing you all here today. I know we work on the Cybersecurity Council together, and you've been very supportive of things like this scholarship program we put in place. One of the challenges we've always had is bringing everybody under the tent of one IT authority over the years. We've worked on training, and they can do it to certain departments, and they encourage others, because I know the IT has training modules. So as far as bringing the IT under an umbrella, I have two questions. One, I know the governor's put $100 million, I believe, in the budget for cyber. Is any of that to help bring it under the one umbrella, and how much would that cost? And then two, is the University of Maryland system under your recommendation to bring them under the IT department?
To answer your second part of your question first, that was not included in the recommendations to bring the USM under the Department of Information Technology or one IT organization.
Let me just follow up. Why not?
We were not asked that question specifically. We addressed specific questions that were given to us, and we did include USM, make a recommendation to include USM on the state, on the Maryland Cybersecurity Coordinating Council as kind of a step toward whole of government cybersecurity. but we didn't take the step of recommending that USM be under do it.
Okay, and to the second, do you know if that's in the 100 million and how much you think it'll cost to go?
No, I'm not familiar with what went into that figure. Maybe Senator Hester could comment on that.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Mr. Chair. I can't comment on the 100 million either. However, we did have 2 states testify before the Joint Committee this year. The first was Vermont. When they consolidated, they saved $15 million a year. North Dakota also testified before us, and they saved $450 million a year. There's no reason to expect that consolidation will cost anything more. In fact, I expect it will save us money.
Okay, thank you. Senator Elfreth.
Not a question, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add that I'm happy to ask B&T staff to share the budget analysis of that 100 million with this committee when we receive it.
Great, thank you. Let me conclude with a question. I think we're about done and we have a voting session. In terms of the recommendations and the consolidation and breaking out of silos, one of the questions that came up on a cyber briefing we had, a joint cyber briefing we had a couple of weeks ago, was the question of transparency versus security. In other words, you want to be as public, you want to be as open with the public when they're affected. On the same token, you don't want to allow information out there that could embolden people who are trying to invade our systems. So I guess my question is, under, I don't know if I want to call it a reorganization, but in terms of the recommendations, where would those questions be resolved in terms of, you know, for example, we recently had a ransomware attack, and DoIT said we didn't have a hack, we had an incident. I mean, I don't know if a ransomware is a hack or not, and as a layperson, to me, even if they were holding us hostage, that's sort of a hack. But how do we take some of these conversations out of the political realm under this new proposal and reorganization in terms of addressing the question of transparency versus security?
Well, I would say, sir, that those are precisely political questions, and it's very difficult to, those are decisions that should be made by policymakers, you know, and as you point out, you're trying to strike a balance. And I think it's a conversation that involves those who do the cybersecurity for day to day, the governor's office and the legislature. That would be my reaction to your question. But I'd like to hear maybe Mr. Yellen, if he could correct or add anything to that, or even Mr. Bell.
Yeah, what's your opinion?
I think the goal of centralization is to get everything under one enterprise, and then you have a centralized decision-making authority. So whether it's policymakers at the legislative level and the executive branch, or within the centralized cybersecurity enterprise, the state is speaking with a single voice. But I would agree with Dr. von Lehman that it is a delicate balance. It is a policy question. I think many members of the public and members of the legislature were, troubled that we weren't able to get more specific information on the MDH incident, but members of the department and members of the Department of Information Technology, I think, had reasonable reasons to, or certainly a basis to keep some information confidential. So it is a very delicate balancing act that I think certainly our report was, that's outside the scope of our report.
Okay, well, that issue will be revisited, I'm sure. Look, I want to thank all of the folks, Dr. Van Lehman, Mr. Yellen, Mr. Bell, obviously our own Senator Fry Hester, who's been an active player in this, and MDEM, Emergency Management, who are willing and offered to play even a more active role in this process. So with that, committee, we will conclude this hearing. It is 3:04, I believe. We'll meet here at 3:15 in the hearing room for a voting session, and we will be masked. So thank everyone for participating. Thank Budget and Tax, and thank the people out there who followed this and are concerned enough to watch it on YouTube.